Your Excellency, Edita Herda, and Co-Chair Ghazali Ohorella, Your Excellencies, distinguished delegates and representatives of states and indigenous peoples, ladies and gentlemen. Gawis ay masdum kanda kayo amin. This means good afternoon in my own Kankanaay Igorot language. I am honored to stand before you today to share my own assessment of the outcome WCIP document on enhancing the system-wide actions of the United Nations for more effective implementation on the rights of indigenous peoples and my recommendations on how to implement this. Indigenous peoples' rights and development issues basically cut across the work of all UN agencies, bodies, programs, and funds. This is one of the main reasons on why indigenous peoples persisted in getting the UN to establish the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues and its Secretariat to help raise awareness and coordinate the UN as far as their policies and programs on indigenous peoples are concerned. I have been actively engaged with many of the UN processes as early as the 1980s as an indigenous activist and leader, so I will speak on the basis of these experiences. In this present era, the world is faced with multifaceted problems in development, peace and security, human rights and environment, increasing inequality and worsening poverty amid scandalous wealth getting concentrated in the hands of the few. Indigenous peoples are equally suffering from these problems. This picture presents a compelling argument for pushing the UN to be more coherent and coordinated in terms of how it addresses indigenous peoples' issues. Most of them are still confronted with problems of grave human rights violations and inappropriate development priorities, which lessen further their capacities to live well and live with dignity. Global decisions on how to pursue development, like the Millennium Development Goals, did not include indigenous peoples. For so long, many indigenous peoples find themselves in the midst of armed conflicts, most of which are not their own wars. Their territories remain militarized, and they are not invited to take part in peace negotiations between the states and armed groups. Thus, the protection of their right to live and the right to their lands, territories, and resources remain very fragile. These situations, which I described, clearly tell us that unless more coherent and coordinated system-wide action from the UN is done, we will find indigenous people's issues always falling between the cracks. We need to understand that indigenous peoples are among those who have continued to contribute significantly in terms of saving the earth by mitigating climate change and strengthening communities who truly believe in and practice sustainability, stewardship, and harmony with nature, mutual reciprocity, and collectivity. We are not simply victims of a system which promotes unrelentless exploitation of the earth and economic growth, bigger profits at the expense of social protection, and also super-individualism. We are doing what we can to contribute solutions to the crisis we all face. It will be to the detriment of the earth and the human society if we continue to be excluded in decision-making processes which impact us and our rights get trampled on a daily basis. When I became a member of the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Peoples and got elected as the chair each year from 2005 to 2009, I understood better how the UN system works. I saw the challenges that need to be addressed and the facilitating factors which enable the UN system to address better indigenous peoples' rights and development. The adoption of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the establishment of the Permanent Forum, the Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and the Special Rapporteur mandate confirms the relevance and importance of indigenous issues to the core purposes of the United Nations and provides the UN system with a common normative framework and specialized mechanisms to promote implementation within the member states and the UN system itself. The UN Declaration is the normative framework which specifically requires the UN system to promote respect for and contribute to full realizations of its provisions through the mobilization of financial cooperation and technical assistance. This established that the UN system has to mainstream the attention to the specific situation of indigenous peoples throughout its diverse agencies, bodies, funds, and programs. Let me highlight the paragraphs of the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples Outcome document, which refer directly to the issue I am asked to address. Paragraph 31 requests the Secretary General to develop a system-wide action plan to ensure a coherent approach to implement the UN Declaration, and for him to report to the 70th session of the General Assembly on progress made. We will look forward to this, and I hope indigenous peoples will be able to participate again in this session. This paragraph also says that a senior official of the UN be assigned to coordinate the action plan at the highest level possible. Paragraphs 32, 33, and 40 are equally important, and paragraph 40 requests the Secretary General to submit recommendations regarding how to use, modify, and improve existing United Nations mechanisms to achieve the ends of the UN Declaration, ways to enhance a coherent, system-wide approach to achieving the ends of the Declaration. I am so happy to see these paragraphs, and I would like to remind everybody that in all this, the effective participation of indigenous peoples in these processes, which will come up with these reports, has to be ensured. Before I was appointed as the UN Special Rapporteur on Indigenous Peoples, my institution, TIBTIBA, commissioned a report on how the UN has implemented the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. This study concluded that there have been some positive developments in terms of coordination between the UN entities on their work on indigenous issues. The establishment of the Interagency Support Group on Indigenous Peoples issues is one mechanism which deals with the issue of coherence and coordination. I was witness to the way this mechanism operated. I frankly think there is still room for improvement, but many of what the IASG has been doing has borne good results. This same report also observed that 4 UN agencies and funds, namely UNDP, IFAD, FAO, and the UNEP, and programs such as the Global Environment Facility and UNRED have developed institutional policies or guidance on support to indigenous peoples. The policies have clear positive effects in terms of enhanced visibility and action, collaboration, commitment, transparency, accountability, and in-house coordination. Further, the recently released UNDP Social and Environmental Standards specify the obligations of the UNDP to not participate in projects that violate the provisions of the UN Declaration, including operational requirements to ensure such compliance. The direct alignment of institutional safeguards with the provisions of the UN Declaration is without any doubt a good practice. Ladies and gentlemen, I will conclude my remarks with some key recommendations which I think should be taken into account on this issue for system-wide coherence and coordination. First, I think it is important that awareness raising within the UN system on indigenous peoples' human rights, development issues, and issues on peace and security has to be ramped up. I observe that majority of the staff of the UN do not really know what the UN Declaration and ILO Convention 169 very well, and that there are bodies like the Permanent Forum, the MRIP, or Special Rapporteur. More effort should be exerted to provide trainings and seminars to UN personnel on these very issues. Secondly, more dedicated staff addressing indigenous peoples' rights and issues should be hired in various UN bodies, agencies, programs, and funds. If the Secretary General will make his assessment of the monitoring of the implementation of the WCIP outcome document, this means indicators should be established for measuring this. One of the indicators will be the number of staff dedicated to implementing policies and programs addressing indigenous peoples. Thirdly, the senior official who shall oversee coordination and system-wide action for coherence should endeavor to consult and involve indigenous peoples in carrying out his work. Fourth, there should be an increase in dedicated resources in terms of funds to support the work on indigenous peoples. Thus, disaggregation of budgets of UN bodies, agencies, programs, and funds in terms of what they have allocated for indigenous people should be done. Fifth, further optimization of the use of the recommendations of the UN Special Rapporteurs, treaty monitoring bodies, ILO supervisory mechanisms, and other monitoring mechanisms to strengthen capacity within the UN system to understand and promote indigenous people's rights should be done. This includes using such recommendations for country programming. Finally, effort should be put in organizing and creating communities of practice of UN bodies, agencies, programs, and funds to come together and share how they are coordinating, what resources are they sharing with each other, and what are the impacts on indigenous peoples. As for my role as the Special Rapporteur, I will commit to monitor closely how the UN is implementing the paragraphs contained in the outcome document. I will endeavor to discuss with the high-level officials of the UN bodies, programs, agencies, and funds, and their staff to offer my help in making their institutions more responsive to indigenous peoples. I sincerely believe this is my role as a rapporteur, and this is what is expected of me by indigenous peoples the world over. I will end by thanking the states of the United Nations, the indigenous representatives, the UN officials and staff who all worked to have this outcome document drafted and finally adopted. I warmly congratulate all of you who have set aside long-standing differences to agree on this document. While this document is not perfect, it is a big stepping stone in the upward struggle to get indigenous peoples' collective and individual rights respected, protected, and fulfilled. Matagot-tagot ako, amin. Thank you very much.